Morning all. The United States of America played Russia yesterday in the Olympiad. Both teams very strong actually. Nakamura on board 1 was playing against Vladimir Kramnik. So 2778 FIDE rating for Nakamura and Kramnik 2797. Okay, on board 2 we had Kamsky against Grishchuk, 2 players again over 2700. And on 3 Honestchuk against Karyakin, and on board 4 Ray Robson 2598 playing against a Russian 2722 on board 4. So the Russian team's all over 2720 actually, every single player. But anyway, board 1, let's have a look. Naka against Kramnik, knight f3 from Naka, knight f6, and now we just see a fianchetto on both sides. So symmetrical on both sides, totally. And Naka decides to transpose it into English opening territory. c4. And in fact we get a kind of Slav Gudingois. Gudingois I believe is with the fianchetto here. Slav defense, Gudingois variation. Knight c3 here, knight e4. Interesting. Black's already threatening, basically. A simple but often effective strategic plan to take on c3 at some point, and to make use of the semi-open c-file on the backward pawn. Very simple plan. And what can white do here? If he takes, then d4's under fire quite uncomfortably. Naka decides to play queen b3, and he doesn't want to leave his queen as a target. After knight takes c3, queen c3 looks pretty wrong in this position. He takes with a pawn supporting his centre. Let's just actually check this out. Can this structural damage scenario be avoided? Queen takes c3, knight c6. Black's already basically equal here. I mean, what's the queen sitting on the c-file for? Anyway, let's go on from there. So b takes c3. White has got some dynamic compensation here, of course. The centre is strengthened. This diagonal might be useful in the future. Black castles, and now knight d2, putting immediate pressure on d5. That's supported with e6, locking out the bishop for a moment. Locking in the bishop rather for a moment. Now e4. Okay, and it looks as though this might be uncomfortable for black, this d5 pressure. Black actually plays knight c6, so he's got a resource here of knight a5 now if ed, and then he can not only get back his pawn but start swooping into the c4 square. Okay, let's just show that. E takes knight a5, I believe. Let's make sure with an engine here, just make sure I'm not embarrassing myself. So e takes d5, I guess knight a5. Okay, queen moves, e takes d, and we got locked down on c4. From an engine point of view, it's still slightly better for white, tiny fraction. Well, it's about equal basically. But anyway, white castled, and we saw knight a5 here, and the queen just humbly going back to d1, and you might find that that's a surprising retreat, but actually queens on d1 are quite central. They can go anywhere they want, still the flexibility, lots of squares. In fact, after queen c7, queen f3 is made use of to temporarily defend the pawn. We saw now b6, and now bishop a3, dislodging the rook from f8. It moves to d8 and gives white an advanced pawn chain now potentially, which Naka chooses to go for with e5. Interesting. It's clearly black's lockdown on the c-file, and c4 looks quite unpleasant here, potentially strategically. Bishop a6 also emphasises light squares, and c4 again. The rook moves, it's attacked as well, rook ac8. So you might think, well, isn't black quite comfortable here? In fact, Kramnik who hasn't lost the game in this tournament, might have been expecting now, after bishop b4. Almost an invitation for a perpetual attack on the bishop with knight c6. And then the bishop can move back and then back to a5 maybe. That might be on the cards. But first, black, Kramnik, he attacks the knight to ask where is that going here. And funny enough, the queen goes back to d1. And okay, there's an open invitation to give up the dark square bishop to get c4, but black will probably end up getting mated on the dark squares in that scenario with the queen going to h6. That looks very, very dangerous indeed. So we have this potential repetition now with knight c6. Kramnik's got a plus score. He beat Aronian earlier in the tournament. He's drawn the others. Why does he need to go for a win? It looks like a very, very pleasant position for black after all here. And in fact, after bishop a3, we get knight a5. We get bishop b4. We get knight c6. And is it going to be a draw? Well, after bishop a3, knight a5, it seems if white wants a draw, he would play bishop b4 again. But thankfully, for spectators and everyone else who might look at this game in the future, no, we actually continue the fight here. Naka continues the fight here, perhaps putting his position under some risk. Looks fairly uncomfortable positionally right now. After all, we do have a backward c-pawn. Black doesn't have a lockdown on c4. Very comfortable bishop here. The only slight downside to black's position might be these dark squares in the future, but they don't look anything near exploitable at the moment. Nevertheless, Naka finds a move here to continue the struggle. Knight b1. He's been retreating his queen, so why not the knight? So he's been retreating his queen to d1 quite a few times now. Okay, so one point is, well, the knight is protecting c3. That's a fairly fundamental point, which means potentially, you know, bishop c1, exchange off bishops, get back on this diagonal, even if the bishop goes to g7. There's also a tactical point here, actually, that knight c4 also offers another possibility. In the game, b5 was played, which looks a little bit surprising, maybe, because it weakens c5. But you might think, well, that might be compensated by b4 in the future. But at the moment, the bishop's also locking down on b4. But b4 in principle for black. There is another key point, though, I think, behind b5 here. That on knight c4, there's a strong option here in the form of bishop f1. You making use of the pin against a6. So this is an engine line from earlier now. So say knight takes a3, bishop takes a6, hitting the rook. Knight takes b1, rook takes b1. This might be quite pleasant for white. If the rook moves, then the c-file pressure has evaporated. White's got control of b5. The opposite colour bishop scenario here looks okay for white. So in the game, actually, in this position, Kramnik, maybe he's also playing for a win, because is that continuation would seem to be in principle drawish. Let's actually check the final position here. Opposite colour bishops, you'd expect this to be slightly drawish. And it's slightly bit better for white. White hasn't got such problems on the c-file now, and the bishop's doing a good job on c8 and c4 here. What about b5, you might ask? It's about equal. So basically Kramnik is also now, okay, in playing b5, that's interesting. That's let's just check knight c4 just to show bishop f1 is a viable alternative to bishop c1. Might be a tiny bit better. Okay, so in the game we get in this position b5. So now we have the potential for knight c4 without the pin bishop f1 against a6. So the lockdown on the c4 square is being emphasised even more. Okay, and we see now h4, which okay, looks like an attacking move to undermine a little bit Black's king position, which looks quite secure at the moment. Now Black gets on strategically with knight c6. He wants to try and undermine White's pawn chain potentially with something like b4 at some point, which could be quite unpleasant. This bishop c5 is addressing perhaps b4 in particular in this position. Of course, it's relying on the fact that knight takes e5 doesn't work here because a rook takes e5. Otherwise, this is a loose kind of bishop. But I think b4 is being discouraged. But also, there's the possibility here of White playing a move like maybe a3 to stop a4, stop b4 for good, or even a4 to try and target this a file and get this rook active. a4 is the more aggressive, of course, there. So in this position, Black's reply is queen b8, and now actually it would seem that a4 can be answered with b4 again, queen supporting b4 if that was on the cards. So now we get this pin though on this diagonal with the queen e2 preventing b4 here. Has White achieved anything in the last few moves? Has Black? Interesting. Black now goes back to a5, eyeing c4 again, and the knight comes out on b1 back to d2. Okay. So now there might be the idea actually of knight b3, or even, as in the game, the knight could venture to the king side quite usefully, like this potentially. Which way the knight goes, it's very, very interesting. And in fact, this question is brought to the fore now because Vladimir Kramnik decides to play an exchange sack here with rook takes c5. Is this exchange sackitis or a very positive, constructive exchange sack? Before we get into that, what were Black's options here before this exchange sack by Vladimir? Queen b7 would seem to be supporting the bishop to allow b4 again, but then bishop f1 maybe, renewing the pin. And it seems technically the position is quite light here. Either h5 or knight b3. If knight c4 here, even nicking the pawn with bishop takes a7 is possible. So this exchange sack promises to, maybe if it gets another pawn, White's going to be in trouble. That's usually the case with such exchange sacks, with Black having that queenside pressure. He plays queen c8. Is he going to get an extra pawn or two? Well, this pawn is let go, and the knight decides on the queen side versus king side issue to go for the king side, to go for the king with knight f3, the start of an attacking maneuver. So exchange for a pawn down, but c3 is weak here. For the moment, b4 is still not possible. So knight h2, the attacking maneuver begins. Bishop goes back to g7. And now, h5 from Naka. And a really, really strange looking move from Vladimir, who up to this moment you'd think his king safety and there was no problems on the king side at all. Astonishing move, I thought, is played here in the form of g5. Engines don't like this move, by the way. It's there might be better technically from an engine point of view. Rook c8, for example. If the queen did nick, if the queen did take on c3 here immediately, is there a problem? Rook ac1. Say queen d4. It looks as though, okay, the attack might be brewing. I think that's the point that maybe Kramnik is scared of. This attack's brewing on the dark squares here. So say Queen F3, eyeing dark squares again like F6. But who knows, it seems as though it might be defensible here. This kind of position might be defensible. Doesn't look as though there's a major issue on the king side. So okay, G5, it does compromise Black's king position a bit. Naka goes in now tactically, pounces in with H6. So he's going to really get something which looks completely impossible before. That Black's king position looks now compromised. If King G7, we have the painful Knight G4. What can defend? I don't think we need to engine check that even. I don't think that's hard to defend. So the bishop goes back, takes on G5, and so we've had some compromise here and a nasty pin. Knight C6, putting more pressure on E5. That's protected, as well as now Knight F6 and Knight H6 on the cards. And here, Vladimir decides the exchange down. He wants the queens off, so he plays Queen E7. And you might think, interesting actually, there's a very interesting decision here played, that if the queen exchange is avoided, Black's still going to have a lot of fun maybe on that C file pretty soon, and torture this pawn, and it's going to be quite hard to break Black's position. But actually, Naka chooses to exchange queens here. There's a slight weakness of the last move in this queen recapture. The knight in the queen recapture is coming off the B4 square, which means in turn that now this next powerful move from white cannot be easily answered with B4. That would represent a pawn sack here. So white is getting a file play against the bishop and pawn now. Interestingly, I think engines still like the idea of B4 as a pawn sack to get bishop C4 in here, as one of the better responses here. B4 is actually the top response, but white's actually better. So it seems the tide has really turned in this position after A4. This very powerful move A4 secures white an advantage after this queen exchange. You might think surprisingly, A4, the blow comes on the queen side. Thought Black was better on the queen side, you might have asked. But now D4, okay, is played, and that looks dangerous for this centre pawn. But I don't know, this is a strange continuation. But A takes B, and A pawn's the first victim. A7, rook A7, hitting the knight. And you might think, well, is the knight going to move to F5? No, in this strange continuation now, gets stranger. Kramnik is gone into truly dynamic mode here. But he's, for the exchange, you know, he hasn't even got a pawn now. It's 4 pawns for white, 4 pawns for black. He is literally the exchange down. And he doesn't decide on the routine knight F5. He plays D3, sacking the knight, to try and make use of his D pawn. He's got ideas like bishop E2 in mind here for the D pawn to be docked on D1 potentially. But no, this knight sack. Well, if he played knight F5, let's have a look at this variation. CD knight D4. White is just exchange up, and this is quite painful here. If king F8, there's knight H7. If king H8, there's rook F7. So this will be a painful scenario, losing the dark square bishop. Then he doesn't have that bishop pair, so he's just a raw exchange down, and it's difficult to get to the F6 pawn here. So that's better for white. So he plays this, I don't know, roll of the dice or something you could call it. This move D3, just offering the E7 knight. It's taken. D2, rook D1 to stop the queen. Bishop E2. Okay, at least he's got the option of taking the rook now after knight E3 at leisure. He takes on E5 first, so we've got a messy position. it's important for white, it seems, to preserve this c pawn. This c pawn is the passed pawn here, and it's moved to c4. And now we have some violence to extend the scope of the dark square bishop and try and expose the king, not immediately executing bishop d1, but try and get a sort of king attack with h5, wrenching open some lines, an attempt to wrench open some lines against the king. Rook a7, h4, and it's not taken here. Even though engines like very, very cold-blooded engines don't care about this potentially dangerous continuation, which maybe Naka didn't like. But if g takes h4 here, which wasn't played, then rook d4, and then we have potentially rook h4 and bishop h2, which is nasty, because remember the bishop's covering this f1 square. So for example, c5, rook h4. In this position, it starts to look a little bit dangerous, but there are moves here. Bishop h1, check, takes, saying it should be okay for white. It still should be okay for white. It's still good for white. Not that dangerous. But Naka chooses a different path then. Maybe he wasn't that frightened of that continuation. He just decides he wants to get this d pawn, but he is losing g3 here, or a pawn anyway in return. So bishop takes d1 is executed, simplifying the position. Knight takes hg, so black is getting at least a pawn there in that situation. So c5, let's do a pawn count. So 3 pawns for black, 1 for white, 2 pawns basically for the knight. So that's the situation now. Black has 2 pawns for that knight, and he starts to try and move his pawns forward, f5, supported by the bishop potentially. But Naka's got the dangerous c pawn, and he's got a rook on the 7th, e5, c6, e4, the pawns are coming down. But this one can be attacked now quite usefully here with bishop h3. Okay, rook c8, attacking white's precious pass pawn, that's protected. Now rook f8, and now the pawn's attacked again. And now here, Vladimir, he hasn't got too many choices in this position. He plays f4, and white misses a tactical shot, it seems, from an engine point of view anyway. Naka could have played in this position rook g5. This is really quite a nasty move. For example, if king f7, then white can swap off the rooks here and play c7 like this. That's just clear that white's pawn is quicker than these guys. And on king h7, then check, winning e4. Okay, that should be quite clear enough. And you might think, hold on a sec, what about king h8 here? Unfortunately I didn't check that earlier. Let's have a check on king h8. So the idea here, oh, is a tactical idea. Oh wow. Rook takes g3, that's very clear, breaking up the pawns. So if takes, we have c7, and we end up with this situation. I'm pretty sure Naka knows how to make with knight and bishop after he queens his pawn. The pawns are going to drop and everything. Okay, so that was a technical win here. Rook g5 immediately. So king f1 was played instead, and the game continued a bit. e3. The pawns are getting blockaded though. It doesn't matter about f3, just take here, and the bishop's eyeing f1. This knight and bishop are doing a good job against the black pawns. Rook f6, check, and white's got the dangerous c pawn, which he's about to take one step further soon. In this position though, first, well, you might think here, hold on a sec, what's up with rook takes and then c7? Actually black's got a little trick there, so that's why white plays king f3. In this position, the little trick on c7 is to play f3 check, and that'll be hard to win now if black's got the bishop. So he takes this, and it's going to be hard to win. Very hard to win. So no, king f3, much better, keeping the blockade. Okay, rook e7, and now white takes on e7 and plays c7. Okay, black plays e2, expecting the same tactic, you know, king takes and then f3 check to win the pawn. But there's a big but here in this particular position. There's a big but. I wonder if you can spot it. Remember, black's threatening to queen immediately with check. So white to play here. If I give you 10 seconds, can you spot the move white plays here in this position? You might want to pause the video as well. So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, of course, c8, not queening, but knight check, under promotion, and supported by the bishop as well. Whoops. So white's just generated an extra piece. Exchange chess. So king f6, king takes e2, and the situation is much nicer for white now, and it is winnable, this situation. Can still transpose into a knight and bishop ending potentially once he mops up the pawns and gets rid of bishop. So we have here a position where the pawns are not going anywhere for a moment. So another one's dropped off, so now that last pawn remains, and the black king is coming down here quite aggressively. f3 stopped there, check, blockaded. Knight e4 check, king h4, and actually you'll notice here that in this position the king has got no exit backwards. Here it's been locked out of going backwards. Knight e5, which would promise to potentially draw the king forward, which is very useful. And in fact here, sorry, instead of knight e5, white apparently has a forced mate here. Using the fact that the black king cannot go forward, it seems apparently this is a forced mate in all variations with king f1. It eventually gets calculated as a mate in 10, believe it or not, or even shorter. Sorry, pardon me, mate in 6 now. King f1 is a mate in 6 in all lines. King f1. And whatever black does, say bishop e7, the king comes to g2, and now basically there's this plan of this. So say bishop d6, offering the bishop, that could be ignored, and now we get this knight e5 to g6, basically mating. So there's the basic mating that has been woven. But anyway, Naka prolongs the torture a little bit longer. So knight e5 check, knight e7, knight e5. The king's not going anywhere. Now king f1, bishop g4. The mating net is still woven here. Now knight h4, and white is going to be mating with the two knights here pretty shortly. Knight f3 and knight g3, little combination. So black's bishop's helpless. The king's position's helpless. So here, Vladimir Kramnik resigned. Let's see a little mate, for example, bishop a7 check, and that would be mate with the two knights, king in the corner. A really interesting game. A bit surprising, you might think. The exchange sack, a little bit of exchange sackitis from Vladimir Kramnik's overexcitement on the queenside pressure. You know, it looked like from the knight e4, carving out this backward pawn on the c file, the the light square strangulation later. It looked as though White had an unpleasant position, if we're going to be honest, and it almost looked as though there was going to be a routine GM draw with the repetition here, and then magical things started to happen. That first of all, and maybe this kind of upset in some way psychologically, or disturbed psychologically, Vladimir, that this draw repetition request in effect was refused. The outrage of it with the move knight b1, an outrageous knight retreat, knight b1. And so b5 looks quite actually committal to start off with, it as the prelude to the exchange sack. But it does cut out the pin. It's got a logical basis for it. It's certainly sealing down the c4 square. From an engine point of view, there are other moves apart from b5, by the way. It might not be it's the engine preferred move b5 here. A move like queen c6, rook d7. What's the idea behind this? You might think, is there an idea behind this? Queen c6. It just looks as though black can maybe pile up the pressure here gradually. Rook b7. Looks as though technically black might be doing fine. But b5, that c5 square weakened, giving a parking place for the bishop. How good is that parking place? Well, actually, it's the basis for black's exchange sack. It tempted black's exchange sack basically. Pretty soon after this knight a5, this exchange sack possibility was on the cards now, and it was made use of here. Again, black didn't have to play the exchange sack. He could have played something calmer, maybe queen b7. But no, the exchange sack made the game very interesting now. But what was really astonishing, personally, for me, I don't know about you guys on YouTube, what was astonishing for me was this move g5. It fragmented black's strong king position. Those three strong pawns there are compromised immediately with g5. Maybe h6 was simply, I don't know, for some reason underestimated anyway. By winning that, the queen now looks unpleasant with the knight coming in on the dark squares, and black's keen now to exchange off the queens. But the surprising twist here is Naka avoiding, not avoiding the queen exchange, because he feels, he's the exchange up here, and this one, although it hasn't been used all game, has got this a4 ready to spring on black's queen side, which is a bit loose now after the queen exchange here. So a surprising turn of events that a4 turns out to be a mega powerful move in this position. And okay, so this now causes a downward spiral for black. He plays d4, which has this knight sack now in mind, and we still get for most of us this would be a very, very tricky imbalance of pieces to work with here. But Neka is very careful to preserve and make use of his past c pawn. The curious event here now is this h4. What was the really scary thing about taking on h4? Did he just want to get this pawn straight off the bat? So his move choice looks fairly good as well, but let's just check this out once more here. It looks a little bit surprising. Okay, g takes h4. I mean, the move played must be considered quite strong. Rook a2, but it seems g takes h4. What would be the problem visualized? Was it really rook d4? if we just revisit this briefly, okay, so that's immediately attacking both pawns, because actually, of course, we've got the threat now of getting the knight away, so rook c4's the threat, so moving that, taking here. Well, black's recapturing the pawn anyway. But here, yeah, white has got at least 2 moves. Maybe bishop b7. Is that viable? No. I suppose there's a concern here about the rook getting behind here. I don't know. It still seems better, but in the game continuation, white ended up better anyway. So this is just curiosity. So rook a2, white's slightly better, clearly better. Bishop takes d1. So black's got some pawns here. White has to preserve his passed pawn and manage black's pawns, get a blockade set up. So the king gets involved pretty shortly to help set up the blockade. Missed tactical shot here would just cleanly win with rook g5 check. Clear win in all variations, it seems. Rook g5 check. But the king comes intuitively to blockade the pawns for the c pawn to be made use of. But understanding, of course, that f3 is a nasty trick at black's disposal. Careful to avoid that f3 trick. And now a little trick of white's own, the underpromotion trick. And it seems a bit tragic that the king kind of comes to commit harikari here by getting trapped in on the king's side. You might think, well, we could have had a long game here if the bishop and the king stayed away. If the king especially stayed away from avoiding the inability to reverse out of this position, but it's getting locked in now. The padlock's been put on the black king, escaping backwards now with the knight and the bishop. And we've got a technical. We had a technical mating net here instead of knight e5. There's a technical mating net with king f1. But anyway, white's winning now, and okay. After a few more moves, well, black resigned. I think black resigned earlier than this, maybe after bishop g4, knight h4. I think somewhere here black resigned. Sorry, I extended the move score earlier. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that game. That was a massive result for the USA yesterday. This particular game. I'm not going to say the match score because I want to look at another maybe 1 or 2 games from this match. It was epic. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, I don't think the USA have ever beaten Russia in chess Olympiads before, and so this game gave a spark of hope that the unthinkable might happen. But let's look at some other games from this match. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.